And we're live. It is Thursday. It is the 10th of July. It is 8:01 a.m. It is the year of our Lord 2025. Um Look, folks, I have a very sad announcement to make. Yesterday evening I kept my promise to the estimable Holly Berkeley Fletcher. And I used my multi-plug adapter thingy to recharge the cactus. And it didn't work. The cactus, I'm afraid, is in fact dead. The snowman is alone and in mourning. Holly doesn't even know this yet. I sent a text with an image to the of the snowman of the cactus being attempting to be revived by the but with the plug to the Dog Shirt TV group thread, and with just the note that I don't think this is working. And the cactus has been laid to rest. It will be lying in state until in my kitchen until Holly gets back from safari. But folks, I think an era of Dog Shirt TV may be at an end. I have discussed the matter with the snowman, who maintains his usual stoic silence, and he's uninterpretable on the subject, as I think only Holly really knows how to decode whatever message that he's sending. I take it to be deep mourning myself. But look, the fight goes on. We lost a soldier, but in the broader Dog Shirt Daily cinematic universe, I will remind you that, the death of one cactus is a tragedy. The death of 1 million cactuses is a statistic. So look, I don't know what to say. The sun is not shining. The birds are chirping. It's going to be a great fucking day, but not for the cactus. And you are watching Dog Shirt TV, and I'm just saying this in loving memory of the cactus. It is an effing revolution in morning television. And one of the revolutionary features, of which there are many, is that we will have on the show a distinguished journalist for one of the country's most celebrated publications. And we will occupy the first 5 minutes of the show with a kind of eulogy for a dead inanimate object that has become a kind of mascot for the show, quite inexplicably, in the presence of another mascot for the show to which we attribute. I mean, there's no other show that does that. When Shane goes on, Mourning Joe to talk about this story, Joe's not asking him about dead inanimate mascot objects.
It's really not.
And another one of the revolutionary features is that once we finish those inanities, we can have a conversation about the CIA, the Tradecraft review, criminal investigations, that is simply out of anybody else's league. So you take the poison with the gold. We are not allowed to have fun anymore, but we are allowed to have Shane Harris, who may have words in memoriam of the cactus, or may just consider this completely beneath his dignity.
He maybe
Shane,
had.
welcome to the show.
Hi, Viva la Revolution, Ben. I'm very
Whoa, I
sorry
just
about your
realized I can't hear you.
cat. I said Viva la Revolution.
Yeah.
I'm very sorry about your cactus. I was imagining
Well, it's
like that's
Holly's cactus, so
Holly, the show's cactus, and,
yeah.
and and by extension, the audience's cactus. I was imagining that scene in what is the opening of the $6 Million Man, where he's like,
We
"What
will
is
rebuild
it? We have
him.
the technology. We can
Yeah,
rebuild him."
we don't have the technology
Sorry,
to
we
rebuild
really
this guy.
don't
No,
in the year
no, the
2025.
cactus is frickin' toast.
I just remember, I remember cactuses too from the Lawfare studio where we used to do Rational Security that were cactus. Those were real cactuses now.
Well, there's also a
What was a
knitted.
crochet
There
cactus?
was a crocheted cactus in the Rational Security Studio that
Jungle
was
studio.
the Jungle Studio. Yeah, so that was actually a cool little item because we had the Jungle Studio, and then the pandemic wiped out all the plants. Not because
They didn't
pan
get
the,
COVID, to be clear. They just
right, they just got
actually.
neglected as a result of the building being empty for a year and a half. So we came back and the place was completely empty. And then it was actually before that. Sorry. So we we used to record in my office,
Yeah.
and we had plants all over the place, and so that's where the Jungle Studio name came from. But then we moved into this snazzy cool studio, which of course doesn't have windows, because you can't have windows in a studio because they're not good for noise proofing. And so we called it the Jungle Studio, but there were no plants. And so the one of our interns crocheted us a cactus, and when we came back from COVID, like, that was the only plant in the Jungle Studio. And there was something like, not only was the cactus the only one that survived, but it was a crocheted cactus, so it couldn't be killed by human neglect.
Indestructible.
Hello, Shane.
Hi, Ben.
um you and I are in sync today because we both wrote about the same subject yesterday.
Uh-huh.
So let's have you tell us a little bit about your story, and um, uh, and then I want to bounce a thesis off of you.
Excellent. Okay, I like that. So the story is about a report called a Tradecraft review that the CIA director John Ratcliffe declassified and published last week. And a little background on what this thing is. Like, a Tradecraft review is basically a lessons learned report that after the CIA creates some analytic product or another report, they kind of go back later and do a postmortem, do an analysis of the analysis. What did we do well? What could we do better? How might we change things for the future? Problems to avoid, good practices to replicate, pretty standard stuff that I think, nobody would find disagreeable. In this case, the Tradecraft review was both ordered by John Ratcliffe, the CIA director, about a much older document, which, as I write in my Atlantic article, is possibly the most scrutinized intelligence product in the history of the U.S. intelligence community, which is the intelligence community assessment into Russian interference in the 2016 election.
What year did you just say?
2016 election.
Okay, just checking. We're not talking about the 2024 election,
Oh,
right?
no.
And we're not talking about the 2020 election.
No, not that one either.
Okay, just checking. So we're talking about review of an intelligence analysis of an election 8 years ago.
That's correct.
Okay, just checking. On you go.
There we go. So, people will remember that assessment found that the Russian government, at Vladimir Putin's direction, had conducted covert operations to try to influence the outcome of the election, sowing social media, using trolls, hacking and leaking emails, and that they did this with the intention of harming Hillary Clinton's candidacy and hoped to help Donald Trump get elected. These are not in dispute, these findings, so we thought, because they've been examined by an independent and bipartisan Senate Intelligence Committee, which was then chaired by Republicans, something called the Mueller Report, which maybe people here remember, a number of other different inquiries into this highly, highly scrutinized document have occurred, but apparently John Ratcliffe, the CIA director, felt that they needed one more.
And just to be clear, when you say not in dispute, it's really not in dispute among people who actually know or care about the truth, because because Trump disputes it constantly, whether just by saying Russia, Russia, Russia,
Yes.
or by saying the Russia collusion hoax or the witch hunt, right? But he and just in case you can hear the squeaking noise in the background, that is
Cactus?
no, that's the puppy chewing on a toy with a squeaker in it.
I'm really liking the soundtrack to this absurd conversation.
Yeah. So.
Yeah, I mean, it's not in dispute the way I could say like that the Earth is round is not in dispute, but there are some people who dispute that.
Right.
I mean, only slightly facetious.
So it's not in dispute among people who have studied the issue with even the remotest pretense of seriousness.
Absolutely. And among those people, I would include the Republican-led staff of the Senate Intelligence Committee, on which, by the way, Marco Rubio was a member at the time, that they produced a 1,300-page document going into that assessment and all other things around the 2016 election interference. So Ratcliffe releases this document that he has directed a few months ago be created. So it's already kind of has this context. And remember, Ratcliffe is also someone who's been very critical of the Russia investigation. He's never said that he's never used the words Russia hoax in the way that President Trump uses them, but he does cast the Russia investigation as politically oriented, politically motivated, and has questioned this other judgment about whether or not the Russians were trying to help Donald Trump get elected. It's something that he has notably avoided talking about in public, even though he agrees with the central findings that Russia did interfere in the election. So that's all notable political context, because this document is not just dropping out of the sky, right? There's a motive, there's a reason for it, and the person who ordered it has a reason to want it. So the document comes out last week, and we can talk about the document itself, but what really is notable is that John Ratcliffe basically holds up this document publicly. An early copy is somehow magically leaked to the New York Post, which dutifully writes it up in a way that Ratcliffe describes it, which is kind of like as this smoking gun document that, as he says in a tweet, proves that Jim Comey and John Brennan and Jim Clapper, who had been the former director of national intelligence, quote, all the world can now see the truth. They manipulated intelligence and silenced career professionals, all to get Trump. That is literally
none of
not
which
what the document says.
None of which is said in the underlying
None of
document.
which is said in the document at all. Now, the document itself, I find a bit tendentious, but it doesn't say that. It really doesn't say that. It doesn't even really come close to saying that. And so Ratcliffe has kind of picked this up as a CIA product and saying, look, the CIA's own analysts, these career analysts, and he thanks them in this tweet saying, thank you to the career officials of CIA. Look what they've come up with. They've demonstrated that this was all political manipulation by these senior leaders, as we've kind of been saying all along. So it's really a remarkable moment that the CIA director orders a report, and when it doesn't say what he wants it to say, he declassifies it, publishes it, and says something anyway that is not supported by the document.
And is it clear to you that it didn't say what he wants it to say, or is it, or maybe he just wanted to, as the kids say, problematize the ICA, and then he would be able to characterize it any way he wants on the theory that the modern, that the right wing fever swamp ecosystem isn't going to actually read the underlying document. So if there's any document that says, hey, there's a problem with the ICA Steele dossier, blah, 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 you can then characterize it any way you want. Do we have any particular reason to believe that Ratcliffe was disappointed in this document?
We don't know. I mean, and it's a really important question because, all we're seeing is the document. We don't know about any conversations in the drafting. We don't know whether there was an earlier version and this is the edited version of that document. I will note that in talking to people who've seen documents like this before, and we should say a tradecraft review is not unusual. Declassifying and publishing it, I think, is unique. I don't think this has ever happened.
And a tradecraft review 8 years after the fact
Yes.
is normally you do a tradecraft review when there is some reason in something like real time to believe that you got something wrong, or you may have gotten something wrong.
Yeah.
You announce before the world, in good faith, in my view, that Iraq has weapons of mass destruction. You go invade Iraq, and then you find out that there are no weapons of mass destruction, and you say, how did the CIA screw that up?
Yes.
You have a tradecraft review, right? But like waiting 8 years in order to produce a tradecraft review is a very strange thing to do, in my view.
And also, and people who I talked to who defended this said, well, we always like to go back and look at our work. And I said, okay, well, how come Mike Pompeo and Gina Haspel, who were the two CIA directors in the first Trump administration, didn't order it?
Deep state agents.
Oh, exactly. Yeah. Notable deep state career intelligence officer, Gina Haspel. I mean, maybe she is. But what was I going to say? So this tradecraft review happens 8 years after the fact. There are people who were involved in writing this intelligence community assessment who aren't even working in the intelligence community anymore. And notably, these reviewers didn't talk to those people, nor did they talk to Jim Comey, Jim Clapper, or John Brennan, all of whom John Ratcliffe, the current director, calls out by name and accuses basically of lying to the American people that didn't talk to them. So they're relying on an unclear body of information. In talking to people who've seen reviews like this, including one person who did work on the ICA at a low level, not one of these political types, it's an unusual looking document. This person said to me, he said, look, when you're basically a baby analyst and taught how to write an analytic product, whatever it might be, one of the things they teach you is don't put your conclusions in a text box, right? Well, this document, there is a big picture takeaway of it, which is essentially, it says, overall, the 2016 intelligence community assessment on Russian election interference was well done, example of analytic rigor, followed the highest standards. Like, it kind of gives it like an A, right? And then the rest of the document is like, but here are all the other places we felt it could have been better and it was weak. And there's this one particular area we want to focus about a key judgment and the level of confidence you gave it. It kind of does all the sort of picking apart stuff. But that key conclusion is like on the 5th page, stuck in a text box. And this person I was talking to who took part in writing the original assessment said, you just wouldn't write it that way. You would put that bottom line up front, right? That's the lead. And by not putting it there, it gives the impression to this reader, and it gave it to me, that the people are trying to do is sort of de-emphasize the positive piece of this, which is that, hey, the original assessment is totally sound.
Yeah,
and
8-year-old intelligence assessment correct.
Yes,
is the lead.
Yes,
like if a normal, like we were asked to review an 8-year-old intelligence assessment, and they got it right. Here are some nits we could pick. We think that there was only moderate confidence on this one sentence. And by the way, there are some process points.
Correct.
That's the way a normal you would think it would be written given the contents of it.
Yeah, that's how you would think it would be written. I have some other concerns about how it's written, if you want to get into it too.
Hang on just a second because we are joined by Nastya, who
I'm just fine listening here.
is
Hi.
joining from Kiev, which had another rough night, and I just wanted to check out whether make sure you and the baby are good, and did you get any sleep, and everything okay?
It was a really bad night, like the worst on my memory, like in years that I've been here, during the first invasion. But we got a little bit of sleep. We left the shelter at like 5:30 in the morning and slept for like 3.5 hours. So that's good by Kiev standards.
Well, feel free to fall asleep at any point in this conversation, and also feel free to break in with any questions, because I know that all of Kiev is on the edge of its seat right now about the integrity of the ICA from 8 years ago, because
Yes,
people are
yes.
incredulous at the suggestion that that the Russians might have interfered in the U.S. election on behalf of Trump. And this must be a really weird story to be following from Kiev.
I have I have questions, but they're actually about Iran. So I can ask now if we have time at the end.
Yeah, well, let's hold the Iran questions for later because we're talking ICA right now.
We're talking ancient history, baby.
Yeah.
We're gonna get into Rome.
Um. So, all right. So, Shane, let's talk about um. Uh. First of all, first of all, finish detailing your anxieties about the substance of the
Yeah.
document. But then I want to move on to what you identify in your article as the purpose of the document and some of the fallout from it.
Yeah, so the other concerns I have about it is, like I said, I've never read a Tradecraft review because they're not made public, but I've read a lot of analytic documents, and this one just has a very argumentative, kind of tendentious quality to it. Um, uh, and it is kind of weirdly constructed. It feels like it's taking great pains to both credit the 8-year-old assessment, but also kind of do this very dutiful nitpicking of it. And as I wrote in the story, it sometimes has the feeling that it's like the written version of a hostage video. Like there are ways that it feels like it was written under duress, and maybe it wasn't. I mean, maybe we will find out that actually the people who wrote this have long-standing deep concerns, and this is how they were voicing them. But because it has all this weirdness to it, I think that's something to draw attention to. The other thing, though, is that in a section where it talks about, like, truly one of my least favorite topics in the world, which is the Steele dossier.
Not not one of my least favorite topics. I I hate it more than I hate talking about the Palestinian-Israeli conflict. I hate it more than I hate talking about Darfur. The amount of ink that has been spilled like blood over this stupid, unimportant. Um, I mean, I just think take Chris Steele and Carter Page and Fusion GPS and Devin Nunes and put them all in a room together and like uh, just stop.
Stop. Yeah, exactly. So it has to get into the Steele dossier because the Steele dossier, which if people are forgetting, and you really just should, but was this compilation of all unverified, very salacious and sinister allegations about Donald Trump and his business ties to Russians, his alleged political ties to Russians, his dalliances with Russian prostitutes. I mean, we all remember this, right? It's the P-tape dossier, right? I mean, that's just the shorthand now of it. And in the fall and winter of 2016, as the U.S. intelligence community and the FBI are focusing on Russian interference in the election, this document, which began as Democratic-funded opposition research into Donald Trump and was written principally by this guy, Chris Steele, a former MI6 officer, is like making its way all over town. Like I have a copy of it, I'm showing it to people, etc.
Including
like,
me.
yeah, I showed it to you. I mean, this is a matter of public record. I mean, I think our emails were published in a congressional investigation into this.
Yep. We and what I did with it was also detailed in said congressional
Right.
investigation. The key point about the Steele dossier is it had nothing to do with anything
Correct.
except the Carter Page FISA application, which everybody acknowledges to have been botched.
Right.
And so
Where did the info come from? Like, where did the author get this information?
Long story, but pulled out of the asses of some of Chris Steele's subcontractors,
right,
is the basic answer.
Have been demonstrated to be quite unreliable, and I think in some cases just making things up.
So there's nothing.
So the conclusion is that it's all wrong. That's the conclusion?
Well, not so. A lot of it is at such a high level of generality that it can't really be wrong. But you should take nothing in it as true. And the result of it was that somebody was wrongly subject to surveillance, and that's really bad. And no conclusion, and then they dropped it because the person was not actually he's a weird ass guy, but surveillance was not fruitful because in fact a lot of the stuff was garbage. And so that aspect of the Russia investigation dropped away, and no conclusions in the Mueller report, no conclusions of the SSCI, or depend on the Steele materials at all. And so it's basically every investigation has dead ends. They shouldn't usually involve civil liberties violations. This one was a dead end that involved civil liberties violations. We should all be candid about that. And that should be the end of the conversation. Instead, it is the sort of bugaboo of everybody who wants to discredit the Russia investigation.
Right, including, by the way, and this gets around back to this recent assessment, including of the current CIA director, who has said in public that the Steele dossier was the reason that that guy. That the Steele dossier was the reason the FBI first opened its investigation of Russian election interference called Crossfire Hurricane. John Ratcliffe has said publicly, it all started with this phony dossier. That's not true. Okay, we don't have to get into the reasons that Crossfire Hurricane started. It was not the Steele dossier. That is like a fact, as in like the sun rises in the east, okay? Like that's just a fact. It's been established, including by people who really don't like the Russian election interference report in the first place. So why are we still talking about this in the context of a Tradecraft review? Well, the reason is that earlier election assessment, that 8-year-old document, it's actually 3 documents, believe it or not. There is a highly classified version that was distributed to a small number of senior government officials and was basically a memo to President Obama. I think that's actually what it's actually called. There's a somewhat less classified version that was a bit more widely shared. And then there's a public declassified version that has all the sensitive sourcing stripped out, but was meant to be basically a way to be transparent with the public. Here's what we found about what Russia did in our election. So there's those 3. The Steele dossier is not included in any of those documents, but there is a summary of the dossier, a 2-page summary in an annex that's attached to the most highly classified version. Okay, right? So we're talking about no dossier like attached to the whole thing. The dossier is not woven into the analysis. It's a 2-page summary in an annex of only the most restricted version. And that version says, in so many words, we did not use this material in any way to reach the analytic conclusions that you're reading in this document about what Russia did, right? So why was it put in there? And the reason it's put in there is important context that is nowhere to be found in this Tradecraft review. And that is, I think, a significant shortcoming. op-ed. So the reason that this even came up when the CIA and the NSA and the FBI, under the direction of the DNI back in 2016, were writing this assessment, which was ordered by President Obama. That's another thing to remember. He had said, go do this. So it's not like they took it upon themselves. The President of the United States told them to do it and to make it public and make a public version.
Which is also not mentioned
That's
in
never
the
mentioned
Tradecraft
in the
review,
assessment.
right?
The assessment says it was done under a compressed timeline. Well, yeah, the President of the United States had said get it done before the inauguration, and they started work on it in December. It also says, by the way, that it was a remarkably good piece of work for having been done in only 2 weeks, which is, I think, notable. Anyway, the FBI, and specifically, and this is all, by the way, documented in the Senate Intelligence Committee report and other places. Like, this is not like sources say. You can go read this for yourself. And so could the authors of this Tradecraft review.
Yeah, there are actually very few episodes in modern U.S. intelligence history that are better documented than this one.
Yeah, that's why I call in my Atlantic story, the ICA, the assessment is like the most scrutinized document in intelligence history. A lot of people have looked at it.
I call it a scab we keep picking at in my piece.
So the FBI in December, when this document is flying all over town, the FBI has a copy of it, right? They've seen it. They know what it is, and they know what it says. And Jim Comey and his deputy, Andy McCabe, at the time, feel very strongly that this document needs to be a part of the final assessment in some way. And their initial kind of proposal, what they're pushing for, is we want to get this into the body of the text itself and somehow kind of weave it in. CIA analysts who are working on this are 100% opposed to this. They have fiercely opposed this. And John Brennan is kind of with them in the beginning, saying, look, the analysts are against this, right? And Jim Clapper is against it as well. And Mike Rogers at the NSA is kind of like, man, now it's up to you guys. He's sort of like, washing his hands of it. But this real debate that is, described in a letter I obtained as a standoff occurs where you've got like basically CIA and DNI on one side and FBI on the other. And they are really arguing about how to get this into the document. And it gets so intense that at one point the FBI threatens to basically remove its seal from the assessment altogether and say, we will pull out of this if we can't resolve this. We won't be a party to the assessment, which is not just like some kind of petulant, I'm going to take my toys and go home, right? The FBI's information, if you're doing an assessment of the Russian interference, is essential. You can't do an assessment without it because they are the ones who are investigating everything that happened in the United States in terms of the social media, the hacking and leaking, all of that stuff. So if FBI pulls out, the whole assessment's going to fall apart. So people have very strong feelings about this. And in that environment, the senior leaders of these agencies have to basically figure out a compromise. And the compromise that they hash out is what they ultimately arrived at, which is this 2-page summary. We stick it in the annex, only the highly classified version, not the public version. And we say very clearly, like, we're putting this in here, but like, we didn't rely on this. And the FBI, just to be clear, in their position is that they felt you have to mention the Steele dossier because President Obama said mention everything that we have in our holdings that relates to Russian election interference. They felt this was relevant to that. The CIA felt very strongly it was not. And they also didn't want to be accused later of having tried to hide it. I mean, already in this document,
they hadn't debunked it yet.
And they hadn't debunked it.
Right, it comes in, they spend months going through it line by line and trying to substantiate it. And then, number one, John McCain starts shopping it all over the place. And so it's by this time, it's semi-public. It wasn't public yet, but
by the time the assessment is published in January, it has been made public. Right. It's been leaked.
And so people, like, a lot of people know about this document, and people are semi-openly talking about it, and everybody knows that somebody is going to publish it eventually.
Totally.
And I want the record to reflect that Lawfare I'll let you speak for the Wall Street Journal, whom you worked for at the time. We made a decision. We are not publishing this
Yeah.
because it's unverified and unverifiable by us. And I thought BuzzFeed's decision to drop it and CNN's decision to publish it were irresponsible. But like it was out there, and so if you're Jim Comey and uh, Andy McCabe saying, "Hey, we got to brief the incoming president on this," which they also did. And we got to include the fact that we have received this is not a crazy thing. On the other hand, if you're General Clapper and Brennan, whose job it is to produce the best analytic product, you really don't want to
Right.
to suggest this is just a reasonable debate among people
Totally.
with different equities in the conversation.
It absolutely is. And you will find no mention of that debate in this Tradecraft review. It doesn't even discuss it. And that is kind of shocking to me, to be honest, because what it does say is it has this kind of line that it pulls from an email between Brennan and a senior CIA official where they're talking about it. And the line is something to the effect of, well, my bottom line is I think it should be in the assessment. And you're like, well, wait a second, hold on. Like, I mean, according to the voluminous record, he arrived at that. And by the way, when we say it should be, he's referring, I think, to the annex summary, not the document. But the Tradecraft review presents this as Brennan was advocating to include the Steele dossier in the assessment, and that's not accurate, right? If there is if that email says something to the opposite effect of that, and we've all been laboring under the incorrect assumption for years about what John Brennan said, then A, release it, but color me skeptical that it actually says that, because John Durham and the Senate Intelligence Committee and Bob Mueller and all these people had access to all this information, and they have never found anything to suggest that the narrative is other than what I just described to you, right?
All
And
right.
so I don't know why the assessment does not take account of that. It's very strange.
So is it fair to say there's an assessment, a Tradecraft review? The bottom line with this 8-page Tradecraft review is that it's got actually its own flaws, its own tendentiousness. It may be wrong on a key point, but it does not say in any event, taking it as the gospel of gospel truth, it does not say anything like what Mr. Ratcliffe say it does. We've been talking about it for 40 minutes, and we haven't gotten to what I think is the key point about it, which is the Fox News story, that not the New York Post story, but the Fox News story that follows it by a few days. So you described in your piece that Fox News story as reflecting the purpose of, or the motive for having this. So tell us about what Fox News reported, and then why you think it reflects the motive. And then I want to talk very specifically about some aspects of that Fox News story.
Okay, so Fox News reports, I think it's now 2 days ago, that the FBI has opened an investigation into James Comey and John Brennan, so the former FBI director and the former CIA director. It acknowledges that the scope of the investigation is unclear. Okay, so why are we reporting it? But it seems what it indicates is that they are investigating potentially false statements, at least by Brennan, as concerns the 2016 election interference assessment, this 8-year-old report, and possible conspiracy between him and Jim Comey. And the false statements appear to...
Conspiracy to do what?
Doesn't say, right? Doesn't really say, but it's all suggestive. And what the Fox News report then says is, this follows on the release last week of a Tradecraft review by John Ratcliffe, which found all of these intelligence anomalies and procedural violations and all of this bad stuff, right? Which we've now exhaustively documented what it actually says. And so, as I write in The Atlantic, what this appears to suggest is that John Ratcliffe is releasing this intelligence community assessment to become some kind of predicate to open a criminal investigation of John Brennan and Jim Comey. And that now we see, like, this is why this document is being made public. This
maybe why it exists at all, right?
Yeah, I mean, and I'm sure that the analyst who wrote it would say, "Oh no, we were tasked to do a Tradecraft review," and that all may be true.
Right.
But what your boss decides to do with that review and how he decides to distort it and weaponize it is beyond your control.
Well, and why he commissions it in the first place. It may be produced in good faith by analysts, although your earlier points raise some interesting questions about whether it was in perfect good faith by analysts, but
yes.
But it may be produced, but why they are tasked to do it in the first place by Ratcliffe is an interesting question. Okay, so I want to ask years ago I wrote a piece for Lawfare, which was kind of a guide to how to read sourcing in stories about national security investigations, major federal investigations. And one of the things I note in it is you relatively seldom see stories attributed explicitly about investigations anyway to Justice Department sources or FBI sources. Usually you'll hear sources familiar with the investigation, or which almost always means defense bar sources. Or sometimes you hear government investigators or just investigators, and that usually actually means congressional investigators. But here you have that rare thing, which is a giant story disclosing an investigation that is sourced explicitly to Justice Department sources.
Yes.
And so you don't go into this in your article. I kind of go into it in mine. But when you combine the point that you made, which is, okay, the motive here seems to be to produce this document in order to then use it as a referral to the Justice Department. And the Justice Department then takes that referral and immediately discloses it to let's just say friendly-minded news organization, and does it as the Justice Department, not it seems to me to support your claim, your hypothesis that this is part of the purpose here, right? The purpose isn't just to generate a criminal investigation. It's to generate an announcement of a criminal investigation. Your thoughts?
I think that's right. I mean, or that's certainly, let's put it this way, that is certainly strongly suggested by the fact pattern that you just laid out. I
mean, you agree with me, right? That the Justice Department is investigating criminally Anastasia Lapatina, Justice Department sources
Please
say
don't.
is a very unusual sourcing pattern in a major federal investigation.
And just to make it even clearer, what's happening here is that people in the Justice Department, presumably working for the Attorney General, are calling Fox News and giving them this, knowing that they will, dutifully report it, and will not say, like, what's this about? And I mean, look, I don't want to impugn the individual who wrote it, but she kind of just did the press release version here, yeah, I mean, you don't see that. Usually, if you're going to have a leak from within the Justice Department about someone who's being investigated, that person doesn't generally want to have it known that they work in the Justice Department and they just told you about a criminal investigation, which they should not be telling reporters about, right? If you're
Doesn't that narrow the circle of people so much, right? How many people have that knowledge of that specific investigation?
Leah, let's do a little bit. So I'm a defrock journalist, so I'm allowed to do this. Shane, for Shane, it would be giving away Tradecraft. But let me go a little deeper than I went in the column. Um, what can you when you see a story that says we're investigating one of the president's political opponents, Justice Department sources say, I think you can make the following assumption. Number one, this did not come from career Justice Department officials, right? This is a political level decision to disclose a federal investigation. Number two, it may have come from the FBI. It may have come from in which case it came from the from the director or the deputy director or somebody working directly for them. Or it may have come from the Attorney General's office or the Deputy Attorney General's office, or somebody working directly for them, i.e., somebody in the Public Affairs office. But you're talking about a very limited number of office sources. This is, remember, you can call the FBI Justice Department sources because the FBI is part of the Justice Department. But you're talking about a universe, it's a small universe of people, and it is a political decision to disclose this. It's not necessarily inappropriate, though in this case it's very inappropriate. But it's not like a line prosecutor, or a line FBI agent, slipping a, bag or a envelope of material in a garage to a Fox News Digital. This is an official decision to make a disclosure. Fair?
Yeah.
Is that fair, Shane?
Totally. Yeah, that's exactly what it is. And by the way, they're not hiding that fact, right?
Right.
I mean, this is something that in doing this, they know exactly that people like me and you and but all especially journalists will see this and know that this
They know we know exactly how to decode it, and they know that we know how to decode it. And so they've taken what they're saying here is, if you know how to read this, you know that we did this and are announcing a criminal investigation as the Justice Department. And by the way, Stephen Miller knows how to decode it too.
Totally. And I will also say what they should know is that when they do that, reporters like me are going to see that and say, right, okay, so we all know what the score is here. And I think we'll begin to wonder, do we really think that this investigation is actually going to amount to anything?
Okay, so brings me to the thesis of my column. There is no investigation. The investigation is, the point of this is not to have an investigation, it's to announce an investigation. Just like the point of the Jim Comey Seychelles issue was not to have a real investigation of whether Jim Comey was threatening to assassinate the president or calling for the assassination of the president. It was to have the theatricality of opening an investigation, interviewing him. And yes, I know they tracked his car, as the New York Times reported yesterday. There was no real investigation. Nobody at the FBI or the Secret Service actually believed for a moment or seriously investigated the idea that Jim Comey was trying to get President Trump assassinated. It's a kabuki investigation. And this is exactly the same thing. You have a document that is ginned up 8 years after the fact in order to pick nits, which you then lie about, release to friendly media, refer to the Justice Department, and announce an investigation. And by the way, there's no real suggestion that, what did Jim Comey and Jim Clapper and John Brennan conspire to do? What crime did they supposedly? And by the way, all of this is presumptively well beyond statutes of limitations anyway. And when you have that collection of facts, the right conclusion is that the announcement having an open investigation is the objective, both for public consumption and for Trump's consumption, but that there is no reason to think there is actually any investigative activity that's likely to happen here that is not a kabuki theater matter. Yes,
Can I
Nastia.
ask, yeah, can I ask a very naive Ukrainian question? What's the point of all of this if both men are out of power? It's been years. Like, who gives a shit? Is kind of my understanding.
Yeah.
Is that a fair question? Like,
Yeah. No,
it's
I
like
think
it's not
that's
like
actually what
they
we can
have
go to.
they have recent enemies, right? Like they have fights that are also to show that you're a wannabe dictator, but they're at least recent, right? Like if they want to pick a fight, they can find a fight. But like going back then,
It's not a stupid naive question.
It's
It's
the right
actually
question.
the most interesting question
okay.
about this thing, which is why would you do this? Well, like what's the value? So Shane, you give your answer to this question and then I will give mine.
The reason that they do that, that Trump administration officials do this, and they have done it for years, is because they want and need to create a kind of universe narrative, right? This extended universe kind of story in which their political enemies in the deep state, Jim Comey and John Brennan being like, the two top ones, like the Emperor and Darth Vader, these two guys, have been conspiring and working behind the scenes for years to stop Donald Trump from getting elected, to hobble his presidency, to undermine him. They hate Donald Trump. They, by extension, hate all of you who support Donald Trump. They abuse the levers of
They hate
power.
America. They're
Hate
not real
America.
Americans.
Donald Trump is here to save America, to take back those levers of power. You hear this phrase over and over again now. We are ending, and Ratcliffe used it in a statement that he gave me through his spokesperson. We're ending the weaponization of intelligence, right? So they have to create this story, and the story is the important thing. The narrative is what is all important. And, another example of this, Nasi, that gets to your questions, like you had a question about Iran. I'm not sure it was this one, but this happened right after the U.S. bombed Fordo and Natanz and Isfahan and that strike of a few weeks ago. The Defense Intelligence Agency does this preliminary report, which is going to be inconclusive, saying, well, we think maybe it only set the program back by a couple of months. That intelligence report gets leaked for political purposes, by the way, by the president's opponents. It's pretty clear. And what does the administration do? Rather than say, hey, this is an early assessment, we're still taking stock of it, let's not pay too much attention to that. Would love it if intelligence reports don't get leaked. Like, that's the reasonable thing to say. But what do? They attack it. They say it's utter crap. They take a flamethrower to it. They attack the journalists for reporting it. And in that moment, the ferocity of their response told you that the story they want to tell about total destruction of the Iranian nuclear program is more important than whether that actually happened, right? So the narrative is more important than the facts. And this is exactly what's playing out now. It's not that they completely ignore facts, right? But they will overlook and dismiss the ones that don't fit the story. And that's really what's happening in the case now of this, supposed criminal referral
My
involving Jim Comey and John
my
Brennan.
Iran question fit into that actually. My Iran question was about Tulsi Gabbard and like that
Wait,
whole
before
situation,
let's
which
finish
fit
this
into what you're
subject.
saying. No,
Let's
no, no, we
finish this.
don't. Yeah, I'm just saying
Yeah,
that it
yeah.
fit.
Yeah, so I have a slightly different, I agree with everything Shane said, but I think there's a slightly different answer at play here, which is, first of all, Trump cares personally about this issue very deeply. He talks about it remarkably frequently. The Russia investigation is uh, goes to his sense of legitimacy,
Yeah.
and um, and it should, by the way, because getting elected with the help of Vladimir Putin should affect your legitimacy. I mean, we will never know whether that campaign was effective or not, or whether it made a difference in the 2016 election or not. I personally doubt it myself. But there is no question that it raises a legitimacy question for Trump, and he stews about it constantly. This is the text of what becomes the Zelensky phone call impeachment issue. You know, a lot of the subsequent stuff flows out of this. And so there's a level of personal obsession on Trump's part with discrediting this underlying story, which is a problem for him because the underlying story is true. And the underlying story is that Russia, both in the form of its military intelligence, the GRU, and in the form of the late Yevgeny Prigozhin's Internet Research Agency, took active measures to involve themselves in the U.S. election on Trump's behalf. Shane's story has some of this background in it. Renee DiResta on Lawfare yesterday lays it out in like remarkable detail how thick the evidence on this stuff is. She did one of the investigations for the SSCI report. And, you know, this bothers him that this is true and this is known. And so he goes after it over and over and over again. And Ratcliffe knows that and is doing that on his behalf. So that's point number one. Point number two is terrorizing the intelligence community. And, you know, there is a lot going on that falls into this rubric. But one of the things is if you go after the president's legitimacy as a member of the intelligence community, we are never going to forget. We are going to come at you and come at you and come at you. And, you know, it doesn't matter if you're right or wrong. You know, they go after the people who made a wrong inference about the Hunter Biden laptop, the former intelligence officials, the 51 people who signed that letter that turned out to be incorrect, right? It's not if you make public intelligence judgments or private intelligence judgments that are adverse to the president on matters of legitimacy, they do not forget that and they will keep coming at you. And then the third aspect is personal hatred of Jim Comey. And look, Jim's a friend. I have strong feelings about this, but the amount of this that is, Jim was the first senior level administration official to quit/be fired. I mean, he was fired, but, you know, because of Trump rule of law issues, right? He had a clash with Trump about whether the Russia investigation could continue, and Trump hates him very, very deeply. And I think these are three big factors that are all consistent with the one that Shane identified, but are very particular to this situation.
One other thought that I think is worth mentioning in this too is, you know, I had a conversation maybe a week ago, right after this note had come out, with somebody who served at a really senior level in the intelligence community, was a career person, and worked briefly for Trump. And their comment was, you know, this person had briefed to Trump many times on a variety of issues. And one of the things they said that was so striking was whenever we would talk to him about Russian election interference in 2016, we could never get across to him that when we wrote that document in 2016, we were talking about Russia and not about Trump. That he internalized it so much that he thought that the intelligence assessment was about him, was a judgment on him, and not what the Russians did and some things that they did to help him, because they did many other things that were independent of an assistance to him. And I just wonder sometimes. I think it was a sharp observation based on this person's long experience with him. But also, what I do wonder, I don't think for one second Trump has ever read the 2016 intelligence community assessment. I'm not sure that he would even be able to tell you that it's actually a document. But he does know what the Steele dossier is. And he knows in part what the Steele dossier is because Jim Comey told him what it is in January of 2017 when they briefed Trump on Russian interference in the election. And famously, Jim asked to speak to the president privately and said, this thing is out there and you need to know. And then it was actually published online later that night, I think. I think Trump has conflated the intelligence assessment and the Steele dossier.
I completely agree. We got to wrap, but I just shared in the chat my conversation with the other FBI Jim Baker, who was the general counsel at the time, on the Brookings stage, and Jim's, I would say, memorable line from that conversation is, "It was about Russia. It was always about Russia. Full stop."
Yeah.
And the Trump imagines it was all an effort to get him. It was an effort to figure out what Russia was doing. And he's never believed that. Yeah. But if you read the intelligence community assessment, it was about Russia. It was always about Russia. Full stop. Shane, you're a great American. It's great to see you. I'm sorry to have humiliated you by beginning this very substantive conversation with the I don't know, the eulogy for the cactus.
Okay.
The snowman bids you, channeling John Ratcliffe, says you need to stop defaming the CIA analysts by reporting their shortcomings. And Nastya, stay safe. And folks, we're going to be back tomorrow. I don't know if we're going to have a guest. I don't know if, whether Nastya is going to show up and we're going to have a co-host or not, but, or whether we'll get another awesome lecture on the Tokugawa shogunate. But you'll be there, and so will I.